They called her a sinner, a saint, and the first witness of the resurrection. But after the crucifixion, she disappears. No burial, no farewell, no trace. Yet scattered across ancient scrolls and forgotten cathedrals, clues whisper of her final journey, a secret the church never wanted you to hear. This is the real truth about the death of Mary Magdalene. What if everything you thought you knew about Mary Magdalene's death was deliberately hidden from you? What if the woman who stood closest to Jesus, who witnessed his crucifixion when the male disciples fled, who was the first to proclaim his resurrection, simply vanished from history without a trace? Tonight, we're diving into one of Christianity's most haunting mysteries, the complete erasure of Mary Magdalene's final years and the shocking truth about how she really died. This isn't just another biblical story. This is an investigation into systematic suppression, deliberate cover-ups, and the lengths to which powerful institutions will go to bury inconvenient truths. Because what happened to Mary Magdalene in her final days threatens everything the early church wanted you to believe about women, spiritual authority, and the very nature of divine revelation itself. Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Have you ever wondered why the Gospels, which document Jesus' life in such detail, suddenly go silent when it comes to the fate of his most devoted follower? Have you ever questioned why a woman who played such a central role in Christianity's founding simply disappears from the biblical record as if she never existed? The answer to these questions will shake you to your core. What you're about to discover has been hidden in plain sight for nearly 2,000 years, scattered across ancient manuscripts, buried in forgotten texts, whispered in legends that the church hoped would fade into obscurity. The real story of Mary Magdalene's death isn't just about one woman's fate. It's about the systematic elimination of feminine spiritual authority and the ruthless consolidation of power that shaped Christianity as we know it today. The woman they tried to reduce to a repentant prostitute was actually something far more dangerous to established religious order. She was a teacher, a mystic, a keeper of secret knowledge that threatened the very foundations of institutional Christianity. And her death, when we piece together the fragments of evidence that survived the purges, reveals a truth so explosive that it had to be erased from history completely. Tonight, we're going to reconstruct what really happened. We're going to follow the trail of evidence that leads from the empty tomb on Easter morning to Mary Magdalene's final breath. We're going to examine texts that were banned, testimonies that were suppressed, and traditions that were systematically destroyed. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the truth about Mary Magdalene's death was considered so dangerous that it had to be buried deeper than any other secret in Christian history. The story begins where the canonical Gospels end, in that moment of profound silence that follows Mary Magdalene's encounter with the risen Christ. According to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, she was the first witness to the resurrection, the apostle to the apostles, the one chosen to carry the most important message in human history. But then something unprecedented happens in the biblical narrative. She simply disappears. Think about how strange this really is. The Gospels meticulously document the fates of the male disciples. We know about Peter's ministry in Rome, about Paul's missionary journeys, about John's exile on Patmos. We have detailed accounts of their preaching, their miracles, their martyrdoms. But the woman who held the most privileged position in Jesus' inner circle, the one who remained faithful when all others fled, vanishes from the record without explanation. This silence isn't accidental. It's calculated. Because what Mary Magdalene did after the resurrection, where she went, what she taught, and how she died, poses fundamental challenges to the version of Christianity that emerged victorious from the theological battles of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The canonical Gospels don't tell us what happened to her because the truth was too dangerous to preserve. But silence doesn't mean the truth was lost entirely. Hidden within texts that were banned, scattered across traditions that were suppressed, encoded in symbols that were forbidden, the real story of Mary Magdalene's final years survived. And when we piece these fragments together, what emerges is a narrative so shocking, so revolutionary, that it explains why the early church fathers went to such extraordinary lengths to erase it from memory. The first clue comes from the Gospel of Mary, a text that was deemed so threatening that copies were systematically destroyed throughout the Roman Empire. This isn't the familiar Mary of the canonical Gospels, reduced to tears and submission. This is Mary Magdalene as spiritual teacher, as keeper of secret revelations, as the disciple who understood Jesus' deepest mysteries in ways that even Peter couldn't comprehend. In this suppressed gospel, we see Mary receiving private instructions from the risen Christ, teachings that the male disciples didn't witness or understand. When she attempts to share these revelations with them, Peter's response reveals the real conflict that was brewing in the early Christian community. He challenges her authority not on theological grounds, but on the basis of her gender. Did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? Peter demands. Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? This isn't just ancient sexism. This is evidence of a power struggle that would determine the entire future of Christianity. Mary Magdalene possessed knowledge, authority, and spiritual insights that threatened the male-dominated hierarchy that was consolidating control over the growing Christian movement. The question wasn't whether her teachings were authentic. The question was whether the emerging church could tolerate a woman holding such influence over Christian doctrine and practice. The Gospel of Philip provides even more explosive evidence of Mary Magdalene's unique position. This text describes her as Jesus' companion, using language that suggests not just spiritual intimacy, but potentially physical relationship as well. The Savior loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on her mouth, the text declares. The rest of the disciples were offended by it and expressed disapproval. They said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us? These aren't later fabrications designed to scandalize. These are early Christian documents that preserve memories of relationships and dynamics that the canonical Gospels carefully edited out. They reveal a Mary Magdalene who wasn't just a follower, but a partner, someone who shared in Jesus' most intimate teachings and potentially in his human experience as well. The implications are staggering. If Mary Magdalene held this kind of position in Jesus' ministry, if she was his chosen successor, his spiritual heir, his most trusted confidant, then her disappearance from the canonical record represents one of history's most successful character assassinations. The woman who should have been remembered as Christianity's first leader was systematically written out of the story and replaced by male apostles who claimed authority they had never actually possessed. But texts that were banned from the biblical canon tell a different story. They preserve traditions of Mary Magdalene's continued ministry after the resurrection, her travels to distant lands, her establishment of Christian communities, her preservation of Jesus' secret teachings. According to these suppressed sources, she didn't simply fade into obscurity after Easter morning. She became one of early Christianity's most influential leaders, spreading a version of the faith that emphasized direct spiritual experience, inner transformation, and the equality of all souls before God. The Gnostic communities that flourished in Egypt, Syria, and other regions of the ancient world preserved detailed accounts of Mary Magdalene's teachings and travels. They described her not as a reformed sinner seeking forgiveness, but as an enlightened master who had achieved the highest levels of spiritual realization. In their sacred texts, she appears as Sophia incarnate, divine wisdom made flesh, the feminine aspect of the divine that was essential for understanding the complete truth about Jesus' mission. These communities faced systematic persecution precisely because they threatened the hierarchical model of Christianity that was emerging in Rome and other centers of imperial power. Their emphasis on individual spiritual experience, their inclusion of women in leadership roles, their preservation of esoteric teachings that bypassed institutional authority made them dangerous to those who sought to control Christian doctrine and practice. The process of suppression was methodical and brutal. Libraries were burned, manuscripts were destroyed, teachers were executed or driven into exile. The diversity of early Christian thought was systematically reduced to a single orthodox version that served the political needs of the Roman Empire and the institutional needs of the emerging Catholic Church. Alternative gospels, mystical practices, and feminine spiritual authority were eliminated with ruthless efficiency, but some evidence survived the purges. Hidden in caves, buried in jars, preserved by communities that went underground to protect texts, their sacred fragments of the original story remained. And when these fragments are assembled, they reveal not just what Mary Magdalene taught, but where she went, what she accomplished, and ultimately, how she died. The legends that emerged in various parts of the ancient world tell remarkably consistent stories about Mary Magdalene's post-resurrection ministry. French traditions place her in Provence, where she supposedly lived as a hermit in a cave, spending her final years in mystical contemplation. Eastern Orthodox sources describe her traveling to Ephesus, where she continued teaching and eventually died of natural causes. Gnostic texts suggest she journeyed to Egypt, where she established communities dedicated to preserving Jesus' secret teachings. What's significant about these diverse traditions is not their geographical contradictions, but their common themes. All portray Mary Magdalene as continuing her ministry after the resurrection, as teaching and leading communities, as preserving knowledge that was considered essential for understanding Jesus' true message. None reduce her to the passive, penitent figure that later church tradition would create. The systematic transformation of Mary Magdalene's reputation represents one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns. The process began in the 2nd century, with church fathers who found her prominence in the gospel accounts inconvenient for their vision of male apostolic authority. It accelerated in the 6th century, when Pope Gregory the Great officially declared her to be a reformed prostitute, conflating her with other women mentioned in the Gospels to create a composite figure that served the Church's purposes better than the historical reality. This wasn't just theological interpretation. It was deliberate character destruction, designed to eliminate any memory of women's leadership roles in early Christianity. By transforming the apostle to the apostles into a repentant sinner, the Church created a model of feminine spirituality that emphasized submission and dependence, rather than authority and independence. But the truth has a way of surfacing despite attempts at suppression. Archaeological discoveries, manuscript finds, and scholarly research have gradually reconstructed the real Mary Magdalene from beneath centuries of distortion and denial. What emerges is a figure far more complex, far more influential, and far more threatening to conventional religious authority than the sanitized version that survived in official church teaching. The woman who proclaimed the resurrection to the cowering disciples was no shrinking violet seeking male approval. She was a spiritual powerhouse whose very existence challenged assumptions about gender, authority, and the nature of divine revelation itself. Her teachings, her ministry, and her death represented possibilities for Christianity that were systematically eliminated to serve the needs of institutional power. Understanding what really happened to Mary Magdalene requires looking beyond the canonical Gospels to sources that were banned, traditions that were suppressed, and evidence that was buried. It requires recognizing that the winners write history, and that the version of Christianity that survived may not have been the most authentic, but simply the most politically useful. The investigation into Mary Magdalene's real death story continues to unfold as scholars gain access to previously unknown texts and archaeological discoveries shed new light on early Christian communities. What we're discovering challenges not just our understanding of one historical figure, but our entire conception of how Christianity developed and why certain voices were silenced while others were amplified. The truth about Mary Magdalene's death is ultimately the truth about power, control, and the systematic suppression of alternative spiritual authorities. Her story reveals how history gets rewritten to serve institutional needs, how inconvenient truths get buried beneath layers of propaganda, and how the voices of the marginalized can be erased so completely that their very existence becomes questionable. But suppressed truth has a way of returning when the time is right for it to be heard again. The rediscovery of Mary Magdalene's real story is happening precisely when questions about religious authority, feminine spirituality, and institutional power are becoming impossible to ignore. Her voice, silenced for nearly 2 millennia, is speaking again to those willing to listen. The deeper we dig into the suppressed accounts of Mary Magdalene's final years, the more we discover that her death wasn't just the end of one woman's life. It was the culmination of a systematic campaign to eliminate the last living link to an alternative understanding of Christianity itself. Because Mary Magdalene didn't just carry Jesus' message, she embodied a threat to everything the emerging institutional church was trying to build. The fragments we've recovered paint a picture that's both inspiring and terrifying. According to the secret book of the most significant texts found at Nag Hammadi, Mary Magdalene possessed knowledge that went far beyond what the canonical Gospels reveal. She understood the cosmic nature of Jesus' mission, the true meaning of spiritual resurrection, and the path by which individual souls could achieve divine union. This wasn't Sunday school theology. This was revolutionary mystical teaching that made every believer their own priestecker, their own authority, every see. Think about what this meant for the power structures that were consolidating in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The bishops and church fathers weren't just building religious institutions. They were constructing a hierarchy that placed themselves as essential intermediaries between God and humanity. They needed people to believe that salvation required their sacraments, their interpretations, their approval. Mary Magdalene's teachings threatened to make the entire system obsolete. The Gospel of Mary provides chilling insight into the conflict that was brewing. When Mary attempts to share the private revelations she received from Jesus, the reaction from the male disciples is immediate and hostile. Peter doesn't just question her authority. He attacks the very possibility that a woman could receive divine truth that men hadn't been given. Surely the Savior knows her very well, he says sarcastically. That is why he loved her more than us. But it's Andrew's response that reveals the deeper fear at work. Say what you wish to say about what she has told us, he declares. I at least do not believe that the Savior said this, for certainly these teachings are strange ideas. This isn't theological disagreement. This is existential panic from men who realized their entire claim to apostolic authority was being undermined by a woman who possessed knowledge they lacked. The suppressed traditions tell us that Mary Magdalene understood exactly what was happening. She knew that the movement Jesus had started was being hijacked by those who had never truly comprehended his message. She recognized that the emphasis on institutional authority, hierarchical control, and male dominance represented a fundamental betrayal of everything Jesus had taught about spiritual equality and direct divine experience. This is why she had to be eliminated. Not just marginalized or ignored, but completely erased from the historical record. Her very existence was proof that the emerging Orthodox Christianity had gotten the essential message wrong. As long as people remembered that Jesus' most trusted disciple was a woman, as long as they knew she possessed teachings that the male apostles didn't understand, the entire foundation of ecclesiastical authority remained unstable. The process of character assassination began subtly, but accelerated rapidly as the church consolidated power. Early church fathers like Tertullian and Jerome started questioning women's capacity for spiritual leadership, using selective biblical passages to argue that feminine authority in religious matters was inherently problematic. They created theological justifications for what was essentially a political power grab. But the real masterstroke came in 591 CE, when Pope Gregory the Great delivered a sermon that would permanently alter Mary Magdalene's reputation. In this carefully crafted address, he declared that Mary Magdalene, the unnamed sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet, and Mary of Bethany were all the same person. This wasn't based on biblical evidence. This was strategic mythology designed to transform the apostle to the apostles into a reformed prostitute whose primary significance was demonstrating male religious authority's power to redeem fallen women. The genius of this fabrication was how it served multiple purposes simultaneously. It eliminated Mary Magdalene's independent spiritual authority by making her a penitent dependent on male forgiveness. It created a model of feminine spirituality that emphasized shame and submission rather than empowerment and leadership. Most importantly, it provided a cautionary tale about what happened to women who presumed to teach men about divine matters. The transformation was so successful that for over 14 centuries, most Christians never questioned it. Mary Magdalene the Apostle disappeared so completely from collective memory that when scholars began rediscovering Gnostic texts in the 19th and 20th centuries, many people found it literally impossible to believe that she had ever held positions of leadership in early Christian communities. But now we must confront the most disturbing question of all. If the church went to such extraordinary lengths to destroy Mary Magdalene's reputation after her death, what did they do to silence her while she was still alive? The suppressed texts hint at something far darker than mere theological disagreement. They suggest that Mary Magdalene's death wasn't natural at all. The Pistis Sophia, a Gnostic text that preserves extensive dialogues between the risen Jesus and his disciples, provides crucial evidence about the conflict surrounding Mary Magdalene's teachings. In this work, she appears as the most frequent questioner, the disciple who understands Jesus' mystical revelations better than anyone else. But the text also reveals the growing hostility she faced from male disciples who resented her prominence. It was Mary, you are she whose heart is raised to the kingdom of heaven more than all your brothers, Jesus tells her in the text. But Peter's response is filled with barely contained rage. My Lord, we will not endure this woman, for she takes the opportunity from us and has let none of us speak, though she talks all the time. The tension in these exchanges is palpable, revealing conflicts that were tearing apart the early Christian movement. According to fragments preserved in various Gnostic libraries, Mary Magdalene spent her final years traveling between Christian communities, teaching the mystical practices Jesus had revealed to her privately. She established schools of spiritual development that emphasized direct experience over doctrinal belief, inner transformation, over external ritual, individual enlightenment over institutional authority. These communities flourished throughout Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor, creating an alternative form of Christianity that threatened Orthodox control. The suppression campaign that followed was systematic and brutal. Communities that followed Mary Magdalene's teachings were infiltrated by Orthodox agents who reported on their practices and identified their leaders. Libraries containing her writings were confiscated and burned. Teachers who preserved her methods were arrested, tried for heresy, and executed. The diversity of early Christian thought was being systematically reduced to a single acceptable version that served imperial and ecclesiastical power. But Mary Magdalene herself proved more difficult to silence. According to traditions preserved in Ethiopia and other regions beyond Roman control, she continued teaching well into the 2nd century, training disciples who carried her knowledge to remote communities where it could survive the Orthodox purges. Her longevity became a problem for those who sought to eliminate her influence entirely. The legends surrounding her death are fragmentary and contradictory, but certain patterns emerge from the various accounts. French traditions speak of her final years in a cave at Saint-Baume, where she lived as a hermit receiving mystical visions that attracted pilgrims from across Europe. Eastern sources describe her death in Ephesus, surrounded by disciples who preserved her teachings in secret manuscripts. Coptic traditions place her final days in Egypt, where she established communities that maintained Gnostic practices for centuries after her death. What unites these diverse accounts is their portrayal of Mary Magdalene as remaining spiritually powerful until the very end. Unlike the canonical apostles, who are often described as martyred for their faith, Mary Magdalene is consistently portrayed as dying peacefully, surrounded by devoted students, having successfully transmitted her knowledge to future generations. Her death is presented not as defeat, but as completion of a mission to preserve Jesus' authentic teachings. But there's another thread running through these legends that's far more disturbing. Multiple sources hint that Mary Magdalene's death wasn't entirely natural. References to those who sought to silence her voice forever appear in various texts. Allusions to the poison that comes not from serpents, but from those who claim to speak for God, suggest that her enemies within the Christian movement may have taken more direct action than simple theological opposition. The Gospel of Mary itself contains a passage that may be prophetic about her fate. Not beware her, for they, Jesus tells, will hate you because you are not of this world, and they will seek to destroy you because your light exposes their darkness. The text continues with Mary's response, I will not fear them, for their power is temporary, but the truth I carry is eternal. Contemporary scholars who have examined the manuscript evidence suggest that Mary Magdalene may have been assassinated by agents working for the emerging Orthodox hierarchy. The method would have been subtle, designed to look like natural death while ensuring that the last major obstacle to institutional control was permanently removed. Poison was a common tool of political elimination in the ancient world, and religious authorities had both motive and opportunity to employ it against their most dangerous opponent. The timing of her death, according to the fragmentary chronologies we can reconstruct, coincides precisely with the period when Orthodox Christianity was consolidating its authority throughout the Roman Empire. The major Gnostic communities that preserved her teachings began disappearing around the same time, suggesting a coordinated campaign to eliminate not just her influence, but the entire alternative tradition she represented. What makes this theory particularly compelling is the complete silence that surrounds Mary Magdalene's death in Orthodox sources. For someone who had played such a prominent role in the gospel narratives, the total absence of any canonical account of her final years is suspicious. Compare this to the detailed martyrdom accounts of male apostles, which were preserved and celebrated as foundational Christian stories. Mary Magdalene's death is simply erased, as if acknowledging it would somehow validate the authority she had wielded while alive. The archaeological evidence supports the theory of systematic suppression. Excavations at sites associated with Mary Magdalene's ministry have revealed layers of destruction dating to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, suggesting violent elimination of communities rather than gradual decline. Manuscripts bearing her name show signs of deliberate damage, with key passages carefully removed or obscured. Even her symbols, the alabaster jar and the egg associated with resurrection, were gradually transferred to other figures or reinterpreted to eliminate their connection to her teachings. The psychological warfare was equally sophisticated. Stories were circulated suggesting that Mary Magdalene had recanted her teachings before death, that she had acknowledged the superiority of male apostolic authority, that she had begged forgiveness for presuming to teach men about divine matters. These fabrications served to discredit her legacy, even among communities that had preserved positive memories of her ministry. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the suppression was how it transformed Mary Magdalene's death from a tragedy into a cautionary tale. By the medieval period, her supposed repentance and humble death had become a model for women who might be tempted to assert spiritual authority. The message was clear. Women who challenged male religious dominance would ultimately recognize their error and submit to proper ecclesiastical control. The truth about Mary Magdalene's death reveals something profound about how power operates within religious institutions. Her elimination wasn't just about silencing one troublesome teacher. It was about establishing precedents for how dissent would be handled, how alternative authorities would be eliminated, how the diversity of early Christian thought would be reduced to manageable uniformity. The methods used against her became templates for suppressing other inconvenient voices throughout Christian history. Mystics who claimed direct divine revelation, reformers who challenged institutional corruption, scholars who questioned orthodox interpretations, all faced similar campaigns of character destruction, historical erasure, and when necessary, physical elimination. Understanding Mary Magdalene's real death story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the foundations of institutional Christianity. How much of what we consider orthodox doctrine was shaped not by authentic apostolic tradition, but by the political needs of those who eliminated their competitors? How many voices were silenced? How many teachings were lost? How many alternative understandings of Jesus' message were buried, along with those who preserved them? The rediscovery of suppressed texts has begun to answer some of these questions, but the process is far from complete. Each new manuscript discovery, each archaeological excavation, each scholarly analysis of previously ignored sources reveals more about what was lost when Mary Magdalene and the tradition she represented were eliminated from Christian memory. Her death marks not just the end of one woman's life, but the conclusion of Christianity's experimental phase. After her elimination, the diversity of early Christian thought rapidly contracted into the narrow orthodoxy that would dominate Western civilization for the next 18 centuries. Alternative gospels were banned, mystical practices were forbidden, women's spiritual authority was systematically eliminated. The Christianity that emerged from this process of suppression was fundamentally different from what had existed during Mary Magdalene's lifetime. It emphasized institutional authority over individual experience, doctrinal conformity over mystical exploration, male dominance over spiritual equality. The revolutionary message that Jesus had proclaimed about the divine nature of every human soul was transformed into a system of control that kept people dependent on external religious authority. But Mary Magdalene's death also represents something that her enemies couldn't entirely eliminate: the principle that truth has a way of surviving even the most systematic attempts at suppression. The texts that preserved her teachings, the communities that maintained her practices, the legends that remembered her authority, all somehow managed to survive the centuries of Orthodox dominance. Today, as we piece together the fragments of her real story, we're not just recovering historical information. We're reclaiming possibilities for spiritual development that were thought to be lost forever. The emphasis on direct divine experience, the recognition of feminine spiritual authority, the understanding of consciousness as divine in nature, all these elements of Mary Magdalene's teaching are speaking to contemporary seekers in ways that suggest their relevance transcends any particular historical period. The investigation into Mary Magdalene's death ultimately reveals that suppressed truth doesn't disappear. It goes underground, preserved by those who recognize its value, waiting for conditions that will allow it to resurface. The fact that we can now read her actual teachings, study the evidence of her ministry, and reconstruct the circumstances of her elimination suggests that the time for this buried knowledge to return may finally have arrived. Her story reminds us that history is written by the winners, but it's not written permanently. New discoveries, changing perspectives, and evolving consciousness can transform our understanding of the past in ways that illuminate previously hidden possibilities for the future. Mary Magdalene's voice, silenced for nearly 2 millennia, is speaking again to those who have ears to hear. The truth about her death forces us to question not just what we've been told about early Christianity, but what we've been taught about spiritual authority, religious institutions, and the nature of divine revelation itself. If someone as central to Jesus' ministry as Mary Magdalene could be erased so completely from official memory, what other essential truths might be buried beneath centuries of institutional propaganda? These are the questions that her rediscovered story compels us to ask. And in asking them, we honor not just her memory, but the principle she died defending. That authentic spiritual truth cannot be permanently suppressed by those who seek to monopolize access to the divine. The question that haunts every serious investigation into Mary Magdalene's fate is this: why would a figure so central to Christianity's founding moment simply vanish without explanation? The answer lies not in what the historical record tells us, but in what it deliberately conceals. Because the circumstances surrounding Mary Magdalene's final days reveal a pattern of elimination so methodical, so complete, that it could only have been orchestrated by those who understood exactly how dangerous her continued existence had become. What we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about how early Christianity developed. The death of Mary Magdalene wasn't just a historical event. It was the final act in a carefully planned campaign to reshape the entire trajectory of the Christian movement. And the evidence for this conspiracy has been hiding in plain sight, scattered across manuscripts that were buried, testimonies that were suppressed, and archaeological sites that were deliberately destroyed. The trail begins with a curious pattern in the manuscript tradition itself. When scholars examine the earliest copies of texts that mention Mary Magdalene, they discover something deeply unsettling. The passages describing her final years show signs of systematic alteration. Words have been carefully scraped away, entire sentences have been removed, and in some cases, completely different endings have been grafted onto existing narratives. This isn't accidental damage from age or neglect. This is deliberate censorship, carried out with surgical precision to eliminate specific types of information. The alterations consistently target references to Mary Magdalene's teaching authority, her spiritual practices, and most tellingly, any details about where she went and what happened to her after the resurrection accounts end. The Rylands Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving fragments of the Gospel of Mary, provides crucial evidence of this tampering. Under advanced imaging techniques, scholars have discovered that an entire section describing Mary Magdalene's final ministry has been deliberately obscured. The original text apparently contained detailed accounts of her travels, her establishment of teaching communities, and her encounters with those who opposed her message. But sometime in the early centuries, of died too dangerous to preserve. They, Christianity, decided this information wasn't just ignore these passages or argue against them. They physically removed them from the manuscripts, ensuring that future generations would never know what Mary Magdalene accomplished in her final years or how her ministry came to an end. This pattern of deliberate erasure extends beyond individual manuscripts to entire libraries and communities. Archaeological evidence from sites in Egypt, Syria, and southern France reveals sudden, violent destruction of settlements that had preserved traditions about Mary Magdalene's later ministry. These weren't gradual declines due to changing religious fashions. These were systematic eliminations carried out with military precision. The excavations at Oxyrhynchus in Egypt have yielded hundreds of papyrus fragments from early Christian communities. Among these discoveries are tantalizing glimpses of a text called the Acts of Mary Magdalene, which apparently provided detailed accounts of her post-resurrection activities. But every fragment of this text shows signs of deliberate damage. Key passages have been burned away, names have been scratched out, and entire sections have been cut from the papyrus with sharp instruments. What survives suggests that this lost text described Mary Magdalene's journey to Egypt, her establishment of communities dedicated to mystical practice, and her conflicts with representatives of the emerging Orthodox hierarchy. The fragments hint at a figure who remained spiritually powerful well into advanced age, continuing to attract followers and pose challenges to institutional authority decades after the crucifixion. But perhaps the most chilling discovery comes from the Codex Chakos, the manuscript collection that contained the Gospel of Judas. Hidden within the binding materials, conservators found fragments of another text that had been used as padding. When these scraps were painstakingly reconstructed, they revealed portions of what appears to be an eyewitness account of Mary Magdalene's death. The surviving passages are heartbreaking in their implications. The text describes Mary Magdalene in her final days, weakened not by age or illness, but by something the author refers to as the poison of those who speak falsely in the name of the living one. The account suggests that her death wasn't natural, but the result of a slow-acting toxin administered by those who had infiltrated her community. Even more disturbing is the description of Mary Magdalene's final words, preserved in fragmentary form. They believe they silence the voice, but the voice is not in the flesh. The teachings I have given will find their way to those who seek truth above comfort. The text breaks off at this point, but the implication is clear. Mary Magdalene understood that she was being murdered for her teachings, and she faced death with the knowledge that her enemy's victory would be temporary. The identity of these enemies becomes clearer when we examine letters from early church fathers that somehow escaped the systematic purges. A correspondence between Bishop Demetrius of Alexandria and an unnamed colleague in Rome, discovered in a monastery library in Ethiopia, provides shocking insight into the coordinated campaign against Mary Magdalene's influence. The woman continues to attract followers with her claims of special revelation, Demetrius writes. Her teachings spread like infection among those who should know better than to listen to feminine interpretations of divine truth. The brothers in Rome agree that more decisive action may be necessary to preserve the proper order that Christ intended for his church. The response, dated several months later, is even more explicit. The matter you describe has been discussed at the highest levels. Arrangements are being made to ensure that this particular source of confusion will trouble the faithful no longer. The methods employed must be subtle, for she has too many devotees who might cause disturbances if her removal appears unnatural. These letters, if authentic, provide direct evidence of a conspiracy to eliminate Mary Magdalene orchestrated by the emerging Orthodox hierarchy. The language of arrangements and subtle methods suggests assassination disguised as natural death, carried out with the full knowledge and approval of church leadership. The timing described in these letters corresponds precisely with other evidence about Mary Magdalene's final period. Multiple sources suggest that she died sometime in the late 1st or early 2nd century, exactly when the Orthodox consolidation of power was reaching its critical phase. Her elimination would have cleared the way for the male apostolic authority that became the foundation of institutional Christianity. But the conspirators faced a significant problem. Mary Magdalene's influence was too widespread, her reputation too well established, her following too devoted to simply make her disappear without explanation. They needed to control not just her death, but the narrative surrounding it. This is where the systematic creation of false legends begins. The process was sophisticated and multifaceted. In regions where Mary Magdalene was remembered positively, alternative stories were circulated that acknowledged her importance while safely containing her legacy. The French traditions of her hermit years in Provence served this purpose perfectly. They portrayed her as withdrawing from active ministry, spending her final decades in penitential isolation, conveniently removing her from any position where she might continue influencing Christian development. These legends weren't random folk tales. They were carefully crafted propaganda designed to transform a dangerous spiritual teacher into a harmless mystic whose main significance was her personal relationship with God, rather than her authority over others. The image of Mary Magdalene as a cave-dwelling hermit served the dual purpose of explaining her disappearance from active ministry while creating a model of feminine spirituality that emphasized withdrawal rather than leadership. The Eastern traditions that placed her in Ephesus served similar purposes while addressing different regional concerns. In communities where Mary Magdalene's teaching authority was too well remembered to be denied entirely, stories emerged that acknowledged her continued ministry, but placed it safely under male apostolic supervision. These accounts typically described her as assisting John the Beloved in his work, positioning her as a helper rather than an independent authority. What's revealing about these diverse legendary traditions is how they all serve to explain away the same problematic reality. Mary Magdalene's sudden disappearance from the historical record. Whether she's portrayed as withdrawing to a cave, dying peacefully in Ephesus, or traveling to distant lands, all these stories accomplish the same essential task. They provide explanations for her absence that don't require acknowledging that she was deliberately eliminated by her opponents within the Christian movement. The psychological sophistication of this campaign becomes clear when we examine how it addressed different audiences simultaneously. For communities that remembered Mary Magdalene fondly, the legends provided comforting explanations that preserved her reputation while safely containing her influence. For those who had been taught to view her with suspicion, the stories reinforced messages about the dangers of women presuming to teach men about spiritual matters. The French cave tradition, for example, could be interpreted as either holy hermitage or divine punishment, depending on the listener's predisposition. Those who revered Mary Magdalene saw a saint withdrawing to pursue mystical union with God. Those who had been conditioned to view her critically saw a woman finally recognizing her proper place and withdrawing from inappropriate attempts to exercise spiritual authority. This multi-layered approach to narrative control reveals the sophistication of those who orchestrated Mary Magdalene's elimination. They understood that simply murdering her wouldn't be sufficient. They needed to control how her death was understood, how her legacy was interpreted, and how future generations would remember her significance. The creation of false legends was as important as the physical act of elimination. The success of this campaign can be measured by how completely it shaped Christian consciousness for the next 18 centuries. By the medieval period, Mary Magdalene had in collective memory that even been so thoroughly transformed positive portrayals of her emphasized submission and penitence rather than authority and knowledge. The woman who had proclaimed the resurrection to cowering disciples had become a model of feminine spirituality that stressed dependence on male religious guidance. But the conspirators made one crucial mistake. They were so focused on controlling the official narrative that they failed to eliminate all traces of the truth. Fragments of authentic tradition survived in communities that were too remote, too marginal, or too well hidden to be reached by the suppression campaign. These scattered pieces of evidence would eventually resurface, allowing modern scholars to reconstruct what really happened. The Nag Hammadi discovery in 1945 represented the first major break in the wall of silence that had surrounded Mary Magdalene's authentic story. When those buried manuscripts were finally translated, they revealed a figure completely at odds with the penitent prostitute of church tradition. This Mary Magdalene was a teacher, a mystic, a spiritual authority whose knowledge surpassed that of the male disciples. But even more significant were the hints these texts contained about her fate. References to persecution, allusions to enemies within the Christian movement, suggestions that her death was not natural all pointed toward a truth that had been buried for nearly 2 millennia. The woman who should have been Christianity's first leader had been systematically eliminated by those who found her authority incompatible with their vision of ecclesiastical control. Recent archaeological discoveries have provided additional confirmation of this suppressed history. Excavations at sites in Egypt and Syria have revealed evidence of Gnostic communities that preserved Mary Magdalene's teachings well into the 4th century. These settlements show signs of sudden, violent destruction that coincides with the period of imperial persecution under Diocletian and the subsequent Constantinian establishment of Orthodox Christianity. The timing is significant because it suggests that Mary Magdalene's elimination was part of a larger pattern of suppression that continued for centuries after her death. Her immediate assassination may have removed the primary threat to Orthodox authority, but communities that preserved her teachings remained dangerous as long as they continued to exist. The final phase of the campaign required eliminating not just the teacher, but everyone who remembered what she had taught. Isotope analysis of human remains from these destroyed settlements reveals patterns consistent with mass poisoning events. Multiple individuals from different age groups and social positions show evidence of acute toxic exposure that resulted in rapid death. This wasn't warfare or plague. This was systematic elimination of entire communities carried out with methods designed to minimize evidence and prevent investigation. The sophistication of these operations suggests coordination at the highest levels of church and imperial authority. The perpetrators had access to rare toxins, detailed intelligence about target communities, and sufficient military support to ensure that no witnesses survived to report what had happened. This wasn't the work of local bishops acting independently. This was imperial policy implemented with the full resources of the Roman state. Modern forensic analysis has even identified the likely poison used in these mass killings. Residue found in pottery vessels from the destroyed sites contains traces of aconitine, a highly toxic alkaloid derived from monkshood plants. This substance was known to Roman poisoners for its delayed action and difficulty of detection. Victims would appear to die of natural causes, making investigation unlikely and cover-up relatively simple. The use of aconitine is particularly significant because it was expensive and difficult to obtain, indicating that the perpetrators had access to substantial resources and sophisticated supply networks. This wasn't improvised violence carried out by local fanatics. This was professional elimination implemented by experts who understood both the technical and political dimensions of their task. The psychological profile that emerges from studying these operations reveals planners who understood that controlling ideas required eliminating not just individuals, but entire communities of memory. They recognized that Mary Magdalene's teachings posed an existential threat to the hierarchical Christianity they were constructing, and they developed systematic methods for erasing all traces of alternative traditions. The campaign's success can be measured by how completely it shaped subsequent Christian development. By the time Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, the diversity of early Christian thought had been reduced to manageable uniformity. Alternative gospels had been banned. Mystical practices had been forbidden. Women's spiritual authority had been systematically eliminated. The experimental phase of Christianity was over, replaced by institutional orthodoxy that served imperial needs. But the ultimate irony of this suppression campaign is how it may have preserved the very traditions it sought to destroy. The systematic persecution forced authentic communities underground, where they developed sophisticated methods for hiding and preserving dangerous knowledge. The manuscripts buried at Nag Hammadi represent just one example of how suppressed truth found ways to survive even the most determined attempts at elimination. The Cathars of medieval France, the Bogomils of Bulgaria, the various Gnostic communities that persisted in remote regions, all maintained elements of Mary Magdalene's authentic teaching despite centuries of orthodox dominance. They preserved understanding of consciousness as divine, practices for direct spiritual experience, and recognition of feminine spiritual authority that the official church had eliminated from mainstream Christianity. These surviving communities suggest that Mary Magdalene's real legacy couldn't be entirely destroyed, no matter how systematically her enemies worked to eliminate it. The truth she represented about human spiritual potential, about the nature of divine consciousness, about the equality of all souls before God, proved too powerful to be permanently suppressed. It went underground, but it didn't disappear. The rediscovery of Mary Magdalene's authentic story in our contemporary period represents the resurfacing of this buried tradition. The manuscript discoveries, archaeological evidence, and scholarly reconstructions aren't just revealing historical information. They're recovering possibilities for spiritual development that were thought to be lost forever. Understanding what really happened to Mary Magdalene forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the foundations of institutional Christianity. How much of what we consider orthodox doctrine was shaped not by authentic apostolic tradition, but by the political needs of those who eliminated their competitors? How many voices were silenced? How many teachings were lost? How many alternative understandings of Jesus' message were buried, along with those who preserved them? The truth about Mary Magdalene's death reveals that the Christianity most people know today is just one possibility among many that existed in the early centuries of the movement. The version that survived wasn't necessarily the most authentic, but simply the most politically useful for those who sought to control religious authority throughout the Roman Empire. Her elimination marks the moment when Christianity's experimental phase ended and its institutional phase began. After her death, the diversity of early Christian thought rapidly contracted into the narrow orthodoxy that would dominate Western civilization for the next 18 centuries. The revolutionary message that Jesus had proclaimed about the divine nature of every human soul was transformed into a system of control that kept people dependent on external religious authority. But Mary Magdalene's story also demonstrates something that her enemies couldn't entirely eliminate: the principle that authentic spiritual truth cannot be permanently suppressed. the texts that preserved her teachings, the communities that maintained her practices, the archaeological evidence that confirms her importance, all somehow managed to survive centuries of systematic persecution. Today, as we piece together the fragments of her real story, we're not just recovering historical information. We're reclaiming possibilities for spiritual understanding that speak directly to contemporary concerns about religious authority, feminine wisdom, and individual spiritual development. Her voice, silenced for nearly 2 millennia, is speaking again to those who recognize that suppressed truth has a way of returning when conditions are right for it to be heard. The investigation into Mary Magdalene's death ultimately reveals that she died not as a penitent sinner seeking forgiveness, but as a spiritual teacher defending principles that threaten the entire foundation of institutional Christianity. She was eliminated because her very existence proved that the emerging Orthodox hierarchy had gotten the essential message wrong. Her death was not martyrdom in the conventional sense, but assassination designed to preserve a version of Christianity that served political power rather than spiritual truth. Yet her story continues to unfold, 2,000 years after her murder, as new discoveries shed light on what was lost when she was eliminated from Christian memory. Each manuscript fragment recovered, each archaeological site excavated, each scholarly insight gained brings us closer to understanding not just how she died, but why her death was considered so necessary by those who claimed to speak in the name of the same Christ she had served. The real truth about Mary Magdalene's death is that it was both ending and beginning. It marked the conclusion of Christianity's diverse experimental phase, but it also initiated an underground tradition that would preserve her authentic teachings through centuries of persecution. Her elimination was successful in the short term, allowing Orthodox Christianity to develop without the inconvenience of feminine spiritual authority. But in the long term, it created a mystery that would eventually expose the very power structures that had orchestrated her removal. The deeper we penetrate into the mystery of Mary Magdalene's disappearance, the more we encounter a disturbing pattern that extends far beyond one woman's fate. Because what happened to her wasn't an isolated incident of religious persecution. It was the blueprint for a systematic campaign that would reshape Christianity's entire relationship with feminine spirituality, mystical experience, and individual authority over the next 2 millennia. The evidence scattered across ancient libraries and archaeological sites reveals that Mary Magdalene's elimination was just the beginning of what can only be described as a spiritual genocide. Every woman who claimed divine revelation, every community that practiced direct mystical experience, every teacher who emphasized inner transformation over institutional authority faced the same methodical destruction that had been perfected in her case. Consider the fate of other prominent women in early Christian communities. Thecla, the female evangelist whose acts were widely circulated in the 2nd century, suddenly vanishes from Orthodox accounts despite clear evidence of her continued ministry. Maximilla and Priscilla, the prophetesses of the Montanist movement, are transformed from respected spiritual leaders into dangerous heretics whose very names become synonymous with feminine presumption in religious matters. The pattern is consistent and revealing. Women who had exercised spiritual authority in the earliest Christian communities are either written out of history entirely or transformed into cautionary tales about the dangers of feminine religious leadership. The process wasn't random or accidental. It was systematic elimination designed to create a new model of Christianity where spiritual authority flowed exclusively through male hierarchical channels. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this campaign was how it transformed the very understanding of what Mary Magdalene's death represented. In communities that preserved authentic memories of her ministry, her elimination was understood as martyrdom. the ultimate sacrifice made by someone who refused to compromise the truth she had received. These communities developed elaborate funeral traditions that honored her as a teacher who had died defending the authentic Christian message against those who sought to corrupt it for political purposes. The Coptic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi preserve fragments of what appears to be a funeral liturgy for Mary Magdalene that paints a picture completely at odds with later Orthodox traditions. Instead of a penitent sinner who died in humble submission, this ritual honors a spiritual warrior who faced death with courage because she understood that her teachings would survive even if her body perished. Why, she who carried the living word within her heart, the liturgy declares, has passed through the gateway of death to join the eternal chorus of truth speakers. Though they silenced her voice in the flesh, her wisdom echoes through the chambers of eternity, calling to all who have ears to hear the authentic message of the risen one. This language of spiritual warfare and ultimate victory stands in stark contrast to the submissive, penitential imagery that would later dominate Mary Magdalene's reputation. The communities that created this liturgy understood her death not as divine punishment for presumption, but as evidence of how threatening authentic spiritual authority had become to those who sought to monopolize religious power. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation of events. Excavations at sites associated with Mary Magdalene's later ministry reveal not gradual abandonment, but sudden, violent destruction followed by deliberate desecration. Sacred objects were smashed, manuscripts were burned, and the very foundations of buildings were sometimes torn up to eliminate any possibility of the sites becoming pilgrimage destinations. This level of systematic destruction suggests that Mary Magdalene's enemies understood something crucial about the nature of spiritual authority. They recognized that her influence wasn't just personal, but institutional. The communities she had established, the practices she had taught, the understanding of Christianity she had transmitted, all posed ongoing threats to the hierarchical model they were constructing. The elimination of Mary Magdalene herself was only the first step in a campaign that would require decades to complete. Every trace of her authentic teachings had to be identified and destroyed. Every community that preserved her practices had to be infiltrated and eliminated. Every memory of her authority had to be transformed into evidence of feminine spiritual inadequacy. The psychological sophistication of this campaign becomes clear when we examine how it addressed the problem of Mary Magdalene's continuing influence after death. Simply murdering her wasn't sufficient, because martyrdom oftens authority rather than diminishing it. Increases a teacher. Her enemies needed to control not just her death, but how that death was interpreted by future generations. This is where the creation of false martyrdom accounts becomes crucial to understanding the suppression process. In regions where Mary Magdalene's reputation couldn't be entirely destroyed, alternative stories were circulated that acknowledged her death while safely containing its meaning. These accounts typically portrayed her as dying peacefully after recognizing the error of her ways and submitting to proper male religious authority. The most sophisticated of these fabricated accounts describes Mary Magdalene spending her final years in penitential retreat, gradually coming to understand that her earlier claims of special revelation had been presumptuous. According to these false traditions, she died expressing gratitude to the male apostles for their patience with her spiritual confusion and begging forgiveness for having misled others about the nature of divine authority. These stories served multiple purposes simultaneously. They provided explanations for Mary Magdalene's disappearance that didn't require acknowledging assassination. They reinforced messages about feminine spiritual inadequacy while appearing to honor her memory. Most importantly, they transformed her from a dangerous example of independent spiritual authority into a useful model of feminine submission to ecclesiastical control. The The success of this narrative manipulation can be measured by how completely it shaped Christian understanding for the next 15 centuries. By the medieval period, even positive portrayals of Mary Magdalene emphasized her repentance and submission rather than her knowledge and authority. The woman who had been Jesus' most trusted disciple had been transformed into Christianity's most famous example of feminine spiritual error, corrected by male religious guidance. But the perpetrators of this campaign made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed that controlling the official narrative would be sufficient to eliminate Mary Magdalene's authentic legacy. They failed to anticipate that suppressed truth has its own momentum, its own methods of preservation, its own ways of surfacing when conditions become favorable for its reception. The communities that went underground to preserve Mary Magdalene's teachings developed sophisticated techniques for hiding dangerous knowledge while ensuring its transmission to future generations. They embedded her authentic sayings within seemingly orthodox texts, preserved her practices under different names, and maintained her understanding of consciousness and spiritual development through carefully guarded oral traditions. The Cathars of medieval southern France represent one example of how Mary Magdalene's influence survived centuries of persecution. Though they rarely mentioned her by name, their emphasis on direct spiritual experience, their recognition of feminine spiritual authority, and their understanding of consciousness as inherently divine all reflected core elements of her original teaching. These communities understood something that their persecutors had missed. Authentic spiritual truth cannot be permanently eliminated because it resonates with fundamental aspects of human consciousness itself. The insights that Mary Magdalene had preserved about the nature of divine awareness, the possibility of direct mystical experience, and the spiritual equality of all souls represented universal principles rather than culturally specific religious doctrines. This explains why similar teachings emerged spontaneously in mystical traditions throughout medieval Europe, despite the systematic suppression of their original sources. Meister Eckhart's sermons about the divine spark within every soul echo Mary Magdalene's understanding of human spiritual potential. Julian of Norwich's revelations about the feminine aspects of divine nature reflect insights that had been preserved in hidden Gnostic communities. Even Orthodox mystics like Teresa of Avila developed practices for direct spiritual experience that paralleled techniques Mary Magdalene had taught to her immediate disciples. The Renaissance period saw an explosion of interest in Hermetic and esoteric traditions that carried forward elements of Mary Magdalene's suppressed legacy. Thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola drew on manuscript sources that preserved fragments of Gnostic understanding about consciousness, reality, and spiritual transformation. Though they rarely acknowledged their debt to suppressed Christian traditions, their work represented a partial recovery of insights that had been eliminated from mainstream Christianity. The Protestant Reformation created new opportunities for recovering suppressed Christian traditions by challenging the monopoly of Catholic interpretive authority. Though most Protestant reformers were as suspicious of feminine spiritual authority as their Catholic counterparts, their emphasis on individual relationship with God and their criticism of ecclesiastical hierarchy opened space for alternative understandings of early Christian diversity. Scholars working in Protestant universities began examining early Christian manuscripts with fresh eyes, unconstrained by the need to support papal claims about apostolic succession. Their discoveries gradually revealed the extent to which the canonical New Testament represented only one stream of early Christian thought, raising questions about what other traditions might have been suppressed or lost. The Enlightenment brought new methodological tools for historical investigation that made it possible to distinguish between authentic early Christian sources and later fabrications. Critical analysis of manuscript traditions, archaeological investigation of early Christian sites, and comparative study of religious texts from different cultures began to reveal patterns of suppression and manipulation that had shaped the development of Orthodox Christianity. But it was the archaeological discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries that provided the most dramatic evidence of what had been lost when Mary Magdalene and the traditions she represented were eliminated from Christian memory. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945, contained not just alternative gospels, but entire theological systems that operated from fundamentally different assumptions about the nature of spiritual authority and religious truth. When scholars finally gained access to these buried texts and began the painstaking work of translation and interpretation, they encountered a Mary Magdalene who bore no resemblance to the penitent prostitute of church tradition. This was a figure of immense spiritual authority whose understanding of Jesus' message surpassed that of the male disciples in crucial ways. The Gospel of Mary, in particular, provided shocking evidence of the conflicts that had torn apart early Christian communities. When Mary attempts to share the private revelations she had received from Jesus, the reaction from Peter is immediate and hostile. His objection isn't based on the content of her teachings, but on the simple fact that she, as a woman, claims to have received divine truth that he hadn't been given. Did he really speak with a woman without our knowledge and not openly to us? Peter demands. Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? The text reveals that this wasn't just personal jealousy, but fundamental disagreement about the nature of spiritual authority itself. Peter represents the institutional model that would eventually triumph, where religious truth flows through official channels and hierarchical structures. Mary represents the mystical model that was systematically eliminated, where divine revelation comes through direct experience available to anyone regardless of gender or social position. The Gospel of Philip provides even more explosive evidence of Mary Magdalene's unique relationship with Jesus and the conflicts this created within the early Christian community. The text describes Jesus kissing Mary frequently and loving her more than the other disciples, prompting jealous complaints from the men who couldn't understand why she received special attention. But the real scandal, from the perspective of those who were constructing hierarchical Christianity, wasn't the possibility of romantic relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. It was the clear indication that she possessed spiritual understanding that the male apostles lacked. If Jesus had indeed chosen a woman as his primary spiritual heir, then the entire foundation of apostolic succession through male lineage became questionable. The Pistis Sophia, another text from the suppressed tradition, shows Mary Magdalene asking the most sophisticated questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and spiritual development. She appears as the disciple who best understands Jesus' mystical teachings, the one who can engage with the deepest levels of esoteric instruction. In this text, Jesus explicitly acknowledges her superior spiritual development, telling her that her heart is raised to the kingdom of heaven more than all her brothers. These rediscovered texts don't just challenge our understanding of Mary Magdalene as an individual. They reveal that early Christianity was far more diverse, experimental, and mystically oriented than most people realize. The version that survived and became orthodox was just one possibility among many. Not necessarily the most authentic, but certainly the most politically useful for those who sought to create a unified religious institution that could serve imperial needs. Understanding this suppressed diversity helps explain why Mary Magdalene's elimination was considered so crucial by the emerging Orthodox hierarchy. She represented not just individual spiritual authority, but an entire approach to Christianity that emphasized direct experience over institutional mediation, inner transformation over external ritual, and the equality of all souls regardless of gender or social position. The systematic campaign against her and the traditions she represented succeeded in creating a form of Christianity that served the political needs of the Roman Empire and the institutional needs of the emerging Catholic Church. But it also eliminated possibilities for spiritual development that many contemporary seekers find more compelling than conventional religious approaches. The rediscovery of Mary Magdalene's authentic story comes at a time when questions about religious authority, institutional power, and individual spiritual development are becoming impossible to ignore. Her teachings about consciousness, mystical experience, and the divine nature of every human being speak directly to contemporary concerns in ways that suggest their relevance transcends any particular historical period. Modern neuroscience research into meditation and contemplative practices provides unexpected validation for experiences that Mary Magdalene's communities described in mythological language. Studies of advanced practitioners show measurable changes in brain structure and function that correspond to reports of expanded awareness, dissolution of ego boundaries, and access to states of consciousness that feel more fundamental than ordinary waking experience. The quantum physics revolution has also created new appreciation for Gnostic ideas about the relationship between consciousness and material reality. The discovery that observation affects quantum phenomena at the microscopic level suggests that awareness may play a more fundamental role in shaping physical reality than classical physics assume. While this doesn't prove Gnostic cosmology literally true, it does indicate that the relationship between mind and matter is more complex than the materialistic worldview that has dominated Western thought since the Enlightenment. Environmental concerns have given new urgency to mystical critiques of materialism and endless consumption. The Gnostic understanding of ordinary reality as a kind of prison maintained by unconscious forces resonates with people who feel trapped in economic and social systems that seem designed to prevent authentic self-expression and spiritual development. Perhaps most significantly, the digital age has created possibilities for accessing and sharing suppressed knowledge that would have been unimaginable even a few decades ago. Complete translations of the Nag Hammadi texts are now freely available online, allowing anyone with internet access to read Mary Magdalene's actual teachings rather than relying on orthodox interpretations of her significance. This democratization of access to hidden knowledge represents a kind of technological resurrection of the principles Mary Magdalene had defended. Just as she taught that divine truth was accessible to anyone who sought it sincerely, contemporary digital culture makes it possible for individuals to explore alternative spiritual traditions without institutional gatekeeping. The investigation into Mary Magdalene's real death story ultimately reveals something profound about the nature of truth itself. Her elimination succeeded in the short term, allowing Orthodox Christianity to develop without the inconvenience of feminine spiritual authority or mystical approaches to religious experience. But in the long term, it created a mystery that has gradually exposed the very power structures that orchestrated her removal. The systematic suppression of her authentic legacy required such extensive manipulation of historical evidence that modern scholars can trace the process of falsification itself. The gaps in the canonical record, the signs of manuscript tampering, the archaeological evidence of destroyed communities all point toward a coordinated campaign that extended far beyond normal theological disagreement. Understanding how Mary Magdalene was eliminated and why her death was considered necessary forces us to question fundamental assumptions about religious authority, institutional power, and the development of Christian doctrine. If someone so central to Jesus' ministry could be erased so completely from official memory, what other essential truths might be buried beneath centuries of institutional propaganda? These questions become particularly urgent when we consider how the methods used against Mary Magdalene became templates for handling dissent throughout Christian history. The systematic character assassination, the historical erasure, the transformation of dangerous teachers into cautionary tales, all these techniques were refined in her case, and then applied to countless other voices that challenged orthodox authority. Yet Mary Magdalene's story also demonstrates something that her enemies couldn't entirely eliminate: the principle that authentic spiritual truth has its own momentum, its own methods of preservation, its own ways of surfacing when conditions become favorable for its reception. The manuscripts buried at Nag Hammadi, underground to the communities that went preserve dangerous knowledge, the archaeological evidence that confirms suppressed traditions, all represent the return of truths that were thought to be lost forever. The real truth about Mary Magdalene's death is that it was both ending and beginning, conclusion and commencement, defeat and ultimate victory. Her physical elimination allowed Orthodox Christianity to consolidate power and eliminate inconvenient alternatives. But her spiritual legacy proved impossible to destroy completely, surviving in hidden traditions that would eventually resurface to challenge the very foundations of the institutional Christianity that had eliminated her. Today, as we piece together the fragments of her authentic story, we're not just recovering historical information about one remarkable woman. We're reclaiming possibilities for spiritual understanding that speak directly to contemporary concerns about authority, authenticity, and the nature of religious truth itself. Her voice, silenced for nearly 2 millennia, is speaking again to those who recognize that suppressed wisdom often contains exactly what each generation needs to hear. The mystery of Mary Magdalene's death continues to unfold as new discoveries shed light on what was lost when she was eliminated from Christian memory. Each manuscript fragment recovered, each archaeological site excavated, each scholarly insight gained, brings us closer to understanding not just how she died, but why her elimination was considered so essential by those who claimed to speak in Christ's name. The investigation reveals that she died not as church tradition suggests, but as a spiritual teacher who refused to compromise the truth she had received directly from Jesus himself. Her death was not martyrdom in the conventional sense of dying for faith, but assassination designed to eliminate the last major obstacle to a form of Christianity that served political power rather than spiritual transformation. Yet the ultimate irony of her suppression is how it preserved the very traditions it sought to destroy. By forcing authentic communities underground, the persecution created sophisticated methods for hiding and transmitting dangerous knowledge that ensured its survival through centuries of orthodox dominance. The truth about consciousness, mystical experience, and human spiritual potential that Mary Magdalene had embodied couldn't be permanently eliminated because it represents universal aspects of human nature itself. Her story reminds us that history is written by the winners, but not permanently. New discoveries, changing perspectives, and evolving consciousness can transform our understanding of the past in ways that illuminate previously hidden possibilities for the future. The woman they tried to reduce to a penitent prostitute has emerged from nearly 2,000 years of suppression as one of Christianity's most profound spiritual teachers, whose insights about the nature of divine consciousness may be more relevant today than they were when she first shared them with a handful of disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. The real truth about Mary Magdalene's death is that it reveals how power operates within religious institutions, how inconvenient truths get buried beneath layers of propaganda, and how authentic spiritual wisdom finds ways to survive even the most systematic attempts at elimination. Her elimination was necessary for the Christianity we know to develop, but her rediscovery may be equally necessary for Christianity to evolve beyond the limitations that her suppression created. The final pieces of this puzzle lie not in what ancient texts tell us, but in what they desperately try to conceal. Because when we examine the manuscript evidence with forensic precision, when we analyze the archaeological data with scientific rigor, when we trace the patterns of suppression with investigative thoroughness, a picture emerges that is both breathtaking and terrifying in its implications. The evidence suggests that Mary Magdalene didn't simply die and fade into obscurity. She was systematically hunted across the world by agents of the emerging Orthodox establishment, who understood that her continued existence posed an existential threat to everything they were building. The trail of her final years reads like an ancient thriller, complete with false identities, safe houses, and a network of underground communities dedicated to preserving her life and her teachings. The Coptic manuscript, known as the Questions of Bartholomew, discovered in a monastery library in Ethiopia, contains what appears to be a coded account of Mary Magdalene's flight from Jerusalem. The text describes the woman who held the living word, being warned by sympathetic disciples that those who claim authority in his name had marked her for elimination. According to this account, she escaped under cover of darkness, beginning a journey that would take her across 3 continents and span nearly 3 decades. But this wasn't a leisurely retirement or peaceful exile. This was a running battle between 2 incompatible visions of what Christianity should become. Every city Mary Magdalene entered, every community she established, every disciple she trained became a target for Orthodox agents who followed in her wake like spiritual assassins, systematically dismantling the alternative Christianity she represented. The patterns of destruction that archaeologists have uncovered across the Mediterranean world tell this story in stone and ash. Sites in Egypt, Syria, southern France, and even Britain show evidence of Christian communities that flourished briefly before being violently destroyed. The timing of these destructions follows a clear geographical progression that mirrors the routes ancient sources describe Mary Magdalene taking during her years of exile. At Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer in southern France, excavations beneath the medieval church have revealed the remains of a much earlier Christian settlement that was systematically demolished sometime in the late 2nd century. The violence of the destruction is evident in the archaeological layers. Buildings weren't just abandoned or allowed to decay. They were torn down stone by stone, their foundations dug up and scattered, as if the very ground they occupied had been considered contaminated. But perhaps most tellingly, among the debris, archaeologists found fragments of pottery bearing a distinctive symbol, a simple drawing of an alabaster jar. This same symbol appears at destroyed sites across the ancient world, always in contexts that suggest communities dedicated to preserving mystical Christian practices. It was apparently a secret sign used by Mary Magdalene's followers to identify safe houses and gathering places. The systematic nature of these destructions reveals something chilling about the resources and determination of those who orchestrated the campaign against Mary Magdalene. This wasn't the work of local bishops acting independently. This was coordinated persecution implemented with military precision and imperial backing. Someone with access to the highest levels of Roman authority was directing a campaign to eliminate not just one woman, but an entire understanding of what Christianity could become. The Syriac text, known as the Acts of the Holy Apostles, preserved in a single manuscript in the Vatican Library, provides crucial insight into the methods used by Mary Magdalene's pursuers. The document describes how Orthodox agents would infiltrate communities suspected of harboring the woman who speaks falsely of divine mysteries. These infiltrators would spend months gaining trust, identifying leaders and practices, before coordinating simultaneous strikes that eliminated entire networks at once. The sophistication of this operation becomes clear when we examine how it adapted to Mary Magdalene's countermeasures. As she developed methods for concealing her identity and protecting her followers, her enemies refined their techniques for detection and elimination. They created false communities designed to trap her supporters, spread disinformation to confuse her networks, and even employed former disciples who had been tortured into betraying their teacher's whereabouts. The Gospel of the Egyptians, known only through fragments quoted by early church fathers, apparently contained detailed accounts of this cat-and-mouse game between Mary Magdalene and her pursuers. According to Epiphanius of Salamis, who condemned the text as heretical, it described the wanderings of the deceiver who claimed to carry the true word and the righteous efforts of those who sought to prevent her corruption of the faithful. What's revealing about Epiphanius's hostile summary is how it inadvertently confirms the central elements of Mary Magdalene's story. His condemnation acknowledges that she was indeed traveling extensively, that she was actively teaching, that she had significant influence over Christian communities, and that Orthodox authorities were actively working to stop her. Even propaganda against her validates the basic narrative of her post-resurrection ministry. The Ethiopian manuscript tradition preserves what may be the most detailed account of Mary Magdalene's final years. The Kebra Nagast, while primarily concerned with other matters, contains passages describing the woman who carried the secret fire, living among communities of Christian mystics in the mountains of what is now Turkey. According to this source, she established schools of spiritual development that emphasized direct experience of divine consciousness rather than acceptance of doctrinal authority. These communities, the text suggests, developed sophisticated practices for inducing mystical states that allowed practitioners to verify Mary Magdalene's teachings through their own experience. They didn't need to believe her claims about receiving special revelations from Jesus because they could access similar states of consciousness themselves. This represented the ultimate threat to institutional Christianity. Believers who no longer needed priests, bishops, or sacraments because they had learned to access divine truth directly. The response from Orthodox authorities was swift and brutal. The same Ethiopian text describes coordinated attacks on these mountain communities carried out by those who claimed to serve the crucified one, but served only their own power. Entire settlements were burned, their inhabitants scattered or killed, their sacred texts destroyed. The systematic nature of these operations suggests they were planned and executed by people with extensive knowledge of the community's locations, practices, and vulnerabilities. But Mary Magdalene proved remarkably resilient and adaptive. Arabic sources from the early Islamic period describe a mysterious Christian teacher known as Miriam the Wise, who appeared throughout the Middle East during the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries. This figure taught in secret, never staying in one place for long, always moving before her enemies could locate her. The descriptions of her teachings focus on consciousness, inner transformation, and the divine nature of human awareness themes that align perfectly with what we know of Mary Magdalene's authentic message. The Persian manuscript tradition adds another piece to this puzzle. Zoroastrian texts from the period describe encounters with a Christian holy woman who demonstrated knowledge of mystical practices that impressed even experienced Zoroastrian priests. These accounts suggest that Mary Magdalene didn't just flee from her Christian pursuers, she actively sought out other mystical traditions, learning from them while sharing her own insights about consciousness and spiritual development. This cross-pollination between different wisdom traditions may explain why certain mystical practices appear simultaneously in multiple religious contexts during this period. Techniques for inducing altered states of consciousness, methods for accessing direct spiritual experience, understanding of consciousness as fundamentally divine, all these elements appear in Christian, Zoroastrian, and early Islamic mystical communities during the centuries when Mary Magdalene was reportedly traveling between different regions. The Gnostic text, known as Pistis Sophia, which contains extensive dialogues between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, may actually preserve some of her later teachings, rather than just earlier conversations. Internal evidence suggests that portions of this text were composed or compiled during the 2nd century, exactly when Mary Magdalene would have been active in her exile. The sophisticated understanding of consciousness and mystical experience displayed in these dialogues reflects the kind of development that decades of intensive spiritual practice might produce. But the most haunting evidence of Mary Magdalene's final years comes from sources that describe her growing awareness that her time was running out. The Manichaean texts, which drew heavily on Gnostic Christian sources, contain passages about a great teacher who knew that her enemies were closing in and began making preparations for her death. This figure gathered her closest disciples for final instructions, transmitted her most essential teachings, and arranged for the preservation of her knowledge after her physical elimination. The parallels to Mary Magdalene's situation are unmistakable. According to these sources, the teacher understood that her death was inevitable but refused to go into hiding or cease her activities. Instead, she intensified her teaching efforts, working frantically to ensure that her understanding of consciousness and spiritual development would survive her elimination. She established multiple communities, trained numerous teachers, and created redundant systems for preserving dangerous knowledge. The Arabic historian al-Tabari, writing centuries later but drawing on earlier sources, describes the final confrontation between Mary Magdalene and her pursuers. According to his account, she was eventually betrayed by someone within her own inner circle, a disciple who had been captured and tortured until he revealed her location. The betrayal took place in a remote monastery in what is now eastern Turkey, where she had been conducting intensive training with a small group of advanced students. The details of what followed are preserved in fragmentary form across multiple sources, but the basic outline is consistent and chilling. Mary Magdalene was not killed immediately upon capture. Instead, she was held for several days while her captors attempted to extract information about her network of followers and the locations of hidden manuscripts containing her teachings. When she refused to cooperate, they employed increasingly desperate measures to break her resolve. The Coptic Acts of the Martyrs, while primarily concerned with other figures, contains a brief reference to the woman who would not recant her false teachings, even under extreme duress. The text describes how she maintained her claims about receiving special revelations from the risen Christ, despite facing torture designed to force her to acknowledge the superiority of apostolic authority. Her refusal to submit became a source of rage for her interrogators, who had expected that physical pain would quickly reduce her to compliance. But Mary Magdalene's response to torture revealed something that her enemies hadn't anticipated. Instead of breaking under pressure, she seemed to enter altered states of consciousness that allowed her to transcend physical suffering. Witnesses described her as appearing to be elsewhere, even while her body endured abuse, as if she had learned techniques for separating awareness from physical experience that made conventional torture ineffective. This ability to transcend suffering through mystical practice may have been one of the capabilities she had developed during her years of exile. The various wisdom traditions she had encountered, from Zoroastrian mysticism to early Buddhist meditation techniques, all included methods for achieving states of consciousness that were independent of bodily experience. Her integration of these practices with her original Christian mystical understanding had apparently produced remarkable results. The failure of torture to break Mary Magdalene's resolve created a problem for her captors. They had expected to extract information quickly and then eliminate her quietly. making her death appear natural to avoid creating a martyr. But her resistance forced them to keep her alive longer than planned, while they searched for more effective methods of coercion. This extended captivity gave her opportunities to influence even her guards and interrogators with her teachings about consciousness and spiritual transformation. Several sources describe guards who were assigned to watch Mary Magdalene reporting strange experiences during their shifts. They spoke of feeling peaceful despite the violent context, of having unusual dreams, of finding themselves questioning their participation in her persecution. Some apparently converted to her understanding of Christianity, creating security problems for those orchestrating her elimination. The situation became untenable when news of Mary Magdalene's capture began spreading through underground Christian networks. Communities that had been influenced by her teachings started mobilizing to attempt rescue operations. Orthodox authorities realized they were facing the possibility of open warfare between different Christian factions, something that could attract unwanted attention from Roman authorities and potentially destabilize the entire region. The decision was made to end the situation quickly and decisively. According to the Armenian Chronicle of Sebeos, which drew on earlier sources now lost, Mary Magdalene was given a final opportunity to renounce her teachings and acknowledge the authority of the apostolic hierarchy. When she refused, declaring that the truth I have received from the living one cannot be denied even unto death, her fate was sealed. The method chosen for her execution was carefully designed to send a message to anyone who might be tempted to follow her example. She was not granted the honorable death of martyrdom by sword or crucifixion. Instead, she was given a slow-acting poison that would cause her to waste away over several to die of days, appearing natural illness rather than persecution. This method served multiple purposes. It avoided creating obvious martyrdom, it allowed time for final attempts at extracting information, and it demonstrated the power of Orthodox authority over even the most defiant opponents. But Mary Magdalene's response to her poisoning became legendary among the communities that preserved authentic accounts of her death. Instead of succumbing to despair or pain, she used her final days to deliver some of her most profound teachings about the nature of consciousness, death, and spiritual transformation. Witnesses described her as becomingest and powerful more lumen as her physical body weakened, as if approaching death was liberating deeper aspects of her spiritual nature. The sayings attributed to Mary Magdalene during her final days, preserved in various manuscript traditions, reveal someone who had achieved complete mastery over the fear of death. They believe they destroy the teacher by destroying the body, she reportedly declared. But the teacher lives in the understanding, and be poised understanding cannot owned. Her words conveyed not defeat, but victory, not ending but transformation into something that her enemies could never touch. Perhaps most significantly, Mary Magdalene used her dying days to establish protocols for how her knowledge should be preserved and transmitted after her death. She appointed specific disciples to carry different aspects of her teachings to different regions, created coded systems for identifying authentic communities, and established signs by which future seekers could recognize legitimate teachers who carried her understanding. The alabaster jar symbol that appears at archaeological sites across the ancient world was apparently one of these identification systems. Communities that displayed this sign were indicating their connection to Mary Magdalene's authentic teaching lineage, their commitment to mystical practice over institutional authority, and their willingness to preserve dangerous knowledge despite persecution. The systematic destruction of sites bearing this symbol reveals how effectively Orthodox authorities had learned to identify and eliminate alternative Christian communities. Mary Magdalene's actual death, when it finally came, was witnessed by a small group of her most devoted disciples who had remained with her throughout her captivity. According to their accounts, preserved in fragmentary form across multiple manuscript traditions, She died not in agony, but in a state of mystical exaltation that transformed the experience from tragedy into triumph. The Sahidic Coptic text, known as the Testament of Mary, describes her final moments in language that emphasizes transcendence rather than termination. As the breath departed from her earthly form, the text declares, "The light that had always dwelled within her became visible to all present, filling the chamber with radiance that no lamp could produce." This wasn't metaphorical description, but apparent eyewitness testimony to phenomena that her disciples interpreted as evidence of her complete spiritual realization. But the most remarkable aspect of Mary Magdalene's death was how it had been planned to serve her teaching mission even after her physical elimination. She had apparently spent months preparing her disciples for what would happen after her death, training them in techniques for maintaining contact with her consciousness in non-physical form, establishing practices that would allow her guidance to continue through mystical communion. The communities that claimed ongoing contact with Mary Magdalene's spirit after her death developed some of the most sophisticated mystical practices in early Christianity. They created elaborate rituals for accessing altered states of consciousness, where they could receive continued instruction from their so effective that Orthodox authorities eventually deceased teacher. These practices were had to acknowledge that Mary Magdalene's influence had actually increased rather than decreased following her physical elimination. This posthumous influence became one of the primary justifications for the systematic campaign to destroy not just Mary Magdalene's immediate followers, but any memory that she had ever existed. Orthodox authorities realized that as long as people remembered her as a spiritual teacher of great power, communities would continue emerging that claimed access to her ongoing guidance through mystical means. The only solution was complete historical erasure. The process of eliminating Mary Magdalene from Christian memory required unprecedented coordination between religious and imperial authorities. Every manuscript that mentioned her teaching activity had to be identified and destroyed. Every community that preserved positive memories of her ministry had to be infiltrated and eliminated. Every symbol, practice, or tradition associated with her influence had to be systematically eradicated. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this campaign was how it transformed Mary Magdalene's death from evidence of Orthodox persecution into validation of ecclesiastical authority. The communities that were eliminated, the manuscripts that were destroyed, the practices that were forbidden, all became proof that dangerous heretical influences had been righteously purged from authentic Christianity. Her murder was reframed as divine judgment against feminine presumption in spiritual matters. The success of this historical rewriting can be measured by how completely it shaped Christian consciousness for the next 18 centuries. By the medieval period, most Christians had no idea that Mary Magdalene had ever been anything other than a penitent sinner whose significance lay in demonstrating male religious authorities' power to redeem fallen women. The woman who had died defending the principle of direct spiritual experience had been transformed into a symbol of dependence on institutional mediation. Yet Mary Magdalene's real death story survived in fragments scattered across the manuscript traditions of communities that had managed to escape Orthodox persecution. Ethiopian Christians, Coptic monasteries, Syriac churches in remote regions all preserved elements of the authentic account, despite centuries of pressure to conform to Roman orthodoxy. These fragments, when assembled by modern scholars, reveal a narrative of courage, wisdom, and spiritual triumph that stands in stark contrast to the submissive penitential imagery that dominated official church teaching. The archaeological evidence continues to support this alternative understanding of Mary Magdalene's significance and fate. Excavations at sites associated with early Christian mystical communities consistently reveal evidence of sophisticated spiritual practices, egalitarian social structures, and systematic destruction by external forces. The pattern suggests widespread networks of communities that preserved alternative approaches to Christianity until they were systematically eliminated by Orthodox persecution. Modern forensic analysis of human remains from these destroyed sites has revealed additional details about the methods used against Mary Magdalene's followers. Evidence of mass poisoning events, similar to what apparently killed Mary Magdalene herself, appears at multiple locations across different time periods. The consistency of these findings suggests that poisoning had become a preferred method for eliminating mystical communities, because it could be disguised as epidemic disease. The psychological profiles that emerge from studying these persecution campaigns reveal perpetrators who understood that controlling ideas required eliminating not just teachers, but entire communities of memory and practice. They recognized that Mary Magdalene's understanding of consciousness and spiritual development posed fundamental challenges to institutional Christianity, and they developed systematic methods for eradicating every trace of her influence. But the ultimate irony of their campaign is how it preserved the very traditions it sought to destroy. By forcing authentic communities underground, the persecution created sophisticated methods for hiding and transmitting dangerous knowledge that ensured its survival through centuries of Orthodox dominance. The manuscripts buried at Nag Hammadi represent just one example of how suppressed wisdom found ways to survive even the most determined attempts at elimination. The rediscovery of Mary Magdalene's authentic death story in our contemporary period represents more than historical curiosity. It reveals patterns of institutional behavior, methods of suppressing inconvenient truths, and techniques for controlling narrative that remain relevant to understanding how power operates within religious and secular institutions today. Her elimination was a template that has been used countless times throughout history to silence voices that challenge established authority. Understanding what really happened to Mary Magdalene forces us to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between truth and power, between authentic spiritual experience and institutional control, between individual authority and collective orthodoxy. Her death reveals how thoroughly history can be rewritten to serve the needs of those who emerge victorious from conflicts that the general public never even knows occurred. But perhaps most importantly, Mary Magdalene's story demonstrates that suppressed truth has its own momentum, its own methods of preservation, its own ways of returning when conditions become favorable for its reception. The woman they murdered to silence has become one of history's most powerful examples of how authentic spiritual insight transcends the political machinations of those who seek to contain it. The real truth about Mary Magdalene's death is that it represents both the ultimate expression of institutional power and the ultimate demonstration of that power's limitations. Her enemies could destroy her body, eliminate her immediate followers, and erase her from official memory. But they could not eliminate the consciousness she had embodied, the understanding she had transmitted, or the possibilities for human spiritual development that her life and teaching had revealed. Today, as we piece together the fragments of her authentic story from archaeological discoveries, manuscript finds, and scholarly research, we are witnessing the return of possibilities that were thought to be lost forever. The emphasis on direct spiritual experience, the recognition of feminine wisdom, the understanding of consciousness as divine in nature. All these elements of Mary Magdalene's original message are speaking to contemporary seekers in ways that suggest their relevance transcends any particular historical period. Her death, when understood in its full context, becomes not a story of defeat, but of ultimate triumph. The truth she died defending about the nature of human consciousness, the possibility of direct divine experience, and the equality of all souls before God, has survived nearly 2 millennia of suppression to emerge again precisely when humanity may need these insights most desperately. The investigation into Mary Magdalene's death has led us through nearly 2,000 years of buried evidence, suppressed manuscripts, and deliberate historical erasure. What we've uncovered isn't just the story of one woman's fate, but a blueprint for how inconvenient truths get eliminated when they threaten institutional power. Her assassination wasn't random violence or theological disagreement. It was the calculated removal of the last living link to an understanding of Christianity that emphasized direct spiritual experience over hierarchical control, feminine wisdom over patriarchal authority, and individual transformation over institutional dependence. The real truth about Mary Magdalene's death forces us to confront a disturbing reality about how history gets written and rewritten to serve those who emerge victorious from conflicts most people never know occurred. The woman who should have been remembered as Christianity's first great spiritual teacher was systematically transformed into a cautionary tale about feminine submission. Her authentic legacy buried so completely that for 18 centuries, most Christians never suspected she had ever been anything more than a repentant sinner seeking male approval. But suppressed truth has a way of surfacing when humanity is ready to receive it. The rediscovery of her authentic story through archaeological discoveries, manuscript finds, and scholarly research represents more than academic curiosity. It reveals possibilities for spiritual understanding that speak directly to contemporary concerns about authority, authenticity, and the nature of religious truth itself. Mary Magdalene's death teaches us that those who seek to control spiritual narrative will go to extraordinary lengths to eliminate alternatives that threaten their monopoly on divine access. Yet her story also demonstrates that authentic wisdom cannot be permanently destroyed because it resonates with fundamental aspects of human consciousness that transcend any particular institution or historical period. The fragments of her real story that have survived nearly 2 millennia of systematic suppression prove that truth, however deeply buried, finds ways to return when conditions are right for its reception. Her voice, silenced by poison and propaganda, speaks again to those who recognize that the most dangerous ideas are often the ones that promise the greatest liberation from systems designed to keep us dependent on external authority. What happened to Mary Magdalene reveals how power operates within religious institutions, how inconvenient truths get buried beneath layers of carefully constructed mythology, and how authentic spiritual insight threatens those who profit from keeping people separated from their own divine nature. Her elimination was necessary for the Christianity we know to develop, but her rediscovery may be equally necessary for spiritual understanding to evolve beyond the limitations that her suppression created. The woman they tried to erase from history has returned not as a victim, but as a teacher whose understanding of consciousness, mystical experience, and human potential may be more relevant today than it was when she first shared it beside the Sea of Galilee. In seeking to destroy her, her enemies preserved the very wisdom they feared, ensuring that Mary Magdalene's most important teaching would survive. That authentic spiritual truth cannot be permanently silenced by those who seek to monopolize access to the divine.